welcome to PowerScore LSAT Podcast, episode 176. My goodness. This is John Dinning, very sleepy in Los Angeles, but I promised this would be out on Wednesday, and it will be out on Wednesday. The clock says 3, but that can't be right. I tell you this, I've poured just about the worst possible drink, shy of NyQuil, that I could have, but I couldn't help myself. It's the first episode of the year. It's the first big test of the year, and we all got through it together somehow. So I popped a really nice bottle of red wine. It's a 2016 Progeny Mount Veeder cab from up in Napa. I normally wouldn't buy a bottle like this cheap, but it was a gift. So let's hope she doesn't listen to this podcast. She'd be a little upset with me. So it goes. I'm not even going to pick a song. We've got too much to get to, both in terms of content and, quite frankly, some of the strangeness that happened over the past week. Most of you will know some of what I'm alluding to. I think very few of you will know all of it, but we're going to get there, I promise. First, though, some quick discussion in the LSAT world, and I'm going to breeze through almost everything until we get to the test content itself, so bear with me. There are 3 tests of some importance, one of which just happened, and I assume that's why you're here. It'd be weird if you were just here to hang out. But the January test, there's really 2 dates left with it of some import. The next Wednesday, the 21st, is going to be the makeup test for this. It runs all day. It's the same kind of administration, in-person or remote. The only real difference in that is it won't be the same content that just got used over the past week. If it is, frankly, it's a mistake, and it's kind of egregious and irresponsible if they do something like that. They shouldn't. But what it'll most likely be is they'll pull some old tests they've used a ton of times from like 2019 to 2022, somewhere in that era, dust it off again and use that. I might use a few different ones, but usually it's pretty limited because there's not that many people who take it. I will make one point to you, though, because I get asked this question a ton about makeups. Does the latest crystal ball still apply? And the answer is sort of. The topic predictions for reading comp? No, those are very specifically chosen because I feel that certain tests are likely to reappear for the main administration. They're not going to use one of those tests. They're that sort of ready and ripe. They're not going to use that for a makeup as a throwaway. So you can ignore the topics. But the recommended problem sets in LR, or sections in LR, the recommended passages for reading comp, the conceptual discussions, even the PTs that I recommended early on in the crystal ball, those should all be perfectly applicable. So if you want to cherry pick your way through it, focus on those elements, go for it. I think you'll be glad you did. Just know that not all of it is really meant for the makeup, kind of by design and by default, really. The next date is a week after that, the 28th, because that, for all of you, is important. That's when the score releases. You'll get your scores likely a little bit before 9 in the morning, Eastern time. They usually come a little early. And then there you go, you're on your way. And hopefully that's the last you ever hear from me. But if not, there are 2 more tests that I'm going to touch on quickly. The first is February. The registration deadline passed a couple days before Christmas Eve. But the test dates are coming up. Frankly, and unfortunately, this is a weird one. They're only running it 2 days. They do this for these smaller tests, and I'll talk numbers in just a second. I guess it's not that weird. They've done it a few times, but coming off a 5-day November and a 4-day January, boy, is this a relief for me. Those are going to run on a Friday and Saturday, the 6th and the 7th of February. You get your scores back from that on February 25th. And then we get a month off, which is nice. And in April, early-ish April, that test is going to kick off. That's the April 9th through the 11th, so it's a 3-day test. That's a test you can still register for. In fact, you've got over a month to decide on that. Fortunately, if you take February and you get your score back on the 25th of February, you will have one more day to the 26th, midnight, to decide on April. So they're trying to stagger it this way, score release and then an extra day to register for the next thing. When you get a month in between, you can do it. They'll do the same with April and June, I'm sure. Speaking of score release for April, you'll get that score back at the very end of the month, April 29th. So there you go. Next couple of tests, I'm not worried about the summer at this point. Let's talk some free stuff, and then we'll start to talk about the January test more specifically. By free, I mean some webinars. I always try to put these on people's calendar. One of them, if you're taking February, would still be applicable, maybe 2. There's one on January 20th, so coming up pretty soon, next Tuesday, on logical reasoning common flaws. I mentioned in the crystal ball that the new content that they're using tends not to have as many of these. They tend to go more into the non-categorical or classifiable flaws more lately, but they are still testing common flaws, both as the flaw and as trap answers. So there's some really valuable stuff here. And they might do something weird in February and just reuse an old test. They've done this before. They did it back in 2023, I think. Fooled us all. So that's a possibility. Early February, a couple days before the test starts, on February 3rd, there's a logical reasoning one on basic conditional reasoning. You struggle a bit with conditionality, at least in its sort of fundamental forms. Go check that out. You'll be glad you did, especially if you're a February test taker and it's worrying you. And then after the February test, a couple weeks later, in fact, on the 18th of February, there's the sibling, the older brother, really, of the basic conditionality. It's advanced conditionality. Focus again on LR. That is of huge import these days because, as many of you just experienced last week, a lot of these new logical reasoning questions are using more complex conditionality. You see this more in like the games, mini games types of questions, which I'll touch on as we get deeper in. So again, something useful if you're still testing. Of course, that would really be relevant for April and beyond. So for anyone listening to this, unless you're just starting out, hopefully you won't need that advanced one. But in case you do, it's there. The other thing, the last thing I'll say here that's happening is next Wednesday night, for those of you in our home stretch course, we've done 3 lessons of it already. Those were leading into January. There is one more, though. Next Wednesday night, the 21st, I'm going to do a final lesson of the home stretch course. This is really kind of devoted to the February test specifically. It'll include more details about January than I can give tonight, so I'll get a little deeper into it. I'll update predictions for February, so you will get kind of a crystal ball for that. And we're going to keep talking about some concepts and stuff, too. I haven't fully made my mind up about what yet. I tend to do these things kind of last minute. But I hope you'll join me next Wednesday night. If you're in the home stretch at all, I hope you'll join me. But certainly if you're taking February, it's going to be a fun time. There's also going to be a crystal ball for April. This just got decided today, so it's not even announced or on the website yet. But to clue you guys in if you need it, I think it's going to be March 4th. All of what I just described starts at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 my time. So there you go. Let's talk then about the January test. And there are a couple of stats and figures that I'll give you. You know, Dave and I got in this rather tedious habit of listing out every day's test takers. I don't really care about that. I don't think you guys do much either. Instead, let me do this. Let me just give you a sense of the size and scope of this test that just happened, because there were nearly 30,000 people registered for it. This is the second biggest test in the past year. The only test larger was the last one in November, which had about 36,000 people. January's got 29,640 people registered. That'll dip a little bit, probably to just around 29,000 flat. That's a huge test. That's bigger than last October, which had about 27,000. Compare it to February, which only has 18,000, and you can see why they can shrink it to 2 days. It's also up about 15% from last January. So, why the interest? Why the affection, really, for this January test from so many people? Why did it attract such a crowd? I think there's 2 reasons. One, schools are just being really slow. They're sluggish these days, and so you can afford to take later tests into the cycle because schools are in no hurry with a larger applicant pool. So I think that was appealing. Second, and I think everybody knows this and kind of groans about it, I certainly do too, for you, there has never been a more competitive time to try to get into law school or to try to get money to go there. Medians are up pretty much everywhere, and especially at the top schools. So that idea of taking one more test for a few more points, that's, not just appealing these days, it's almost necessary in a lot of cases. So I think that's the reason many of you are here listening to this, is trying to eke out a few more points and keep yourself competitive as medians continue to climb. Not to scare anybody, but that is just the simple truth of it. So there you go. As far as test and proctor issues go, let me start with proctor because test is quite a novel. I didn't see a whole lot of proctor issues, but it's the typical remote complaints that you see. Tech, proctors, people having to log in 6 times and do a security check every time. So what we've been saying to people is, if you want a more kind of guaranteed experience, try to go to a test center. They're not without their flaws. Test centers, you can't control the environment around you nearly as much. Proctors talk, people cough and sneeze and whatever. You're in a public place. But at least you don't have the fragility of a remote proctor who doesn't know what you or they are doing, or the possibility that your internet or your power or anything like that could go wrong. The good news, like I said, is there is a makeup next week. The easiest qualifying person for a makeup test is a tech issue person. Proctors are a little harder to pin a makeup on. And then I've been asked things like, I was really sick. And I wasn't feeling good. Will they let me take the test again? No. Or I was at a test center and the proctors were really loud. Will they let me do a makeup? No. It almost needs to be something internal, mechanical almost, before they're kind of going to guarantee that. Now, maybe you could beg and plead your way into it, but chances are not good. I didn't see any reports of like weird platform issues that we've seen for a couple of the past tests where like answer choices were weirdly superimposed on each other or unclickable. Didn't hear any of that. I did, however, here's some news about the test itself, and I'm not going to dive into it quite yet. I want to get into it when we're actually in the reading comprehension discussion in just a minute. But there are two big shocks, really, that came up this week, both unannounced, unsuspected. And I'll get into those when we get into the content, as I say. Before we do, though, just a couple of quick reminders, disclaimers. We do this more or less every time. I'll give them to you here again, and I'll rush through this list because by now most of you have probably heard this. But just the nature of post-test analysis, what it is that I've done, how we do these recaps, and what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here. A few of the things, and we'll talk more about scaling at the very end, so not yet. The first, Dave was big on this. I'm a little less rigid about it. But it would probably be better for everyone if you didn't summarize this just in a quick recap online. There are going to be timestamps. I'm already putting them here in notes and stuff. We'll have timestamps as soon as this comes out. Just send somebody to like the relevant portion. Be like, oh, you want reading comp? 57-minute or whatever. Hopefully not that far out, but you get my point. There's a lot of nuance in this, especially with the test that had as much strangeness as this one did, especially in reading comp. So it probably would be better if somebody could listen to this within the context of what I'm going to say about it. That's my small ask. Section order, I see this every time, doesn't mean a thing. So again, if you're going into this being like, I hope my first LR was this, but you don't remember topics, I can't help you. This is all topics, and it's only ever topics. Sections and orders change. They get interchanged with each other. You can have the same sections as someone else and no overlapping content, some overlapping content. You can have an identical test, but in different orders from other people. Order doesn't mean anything. And if you ever have to take one of these things again and you see people talking about it in terms of section order, you can dispel that, hopefully, as well. I always try to get in there and do it. As far as disclosing information and where I get a lot of this, you can talk about generalities and topics, especially with someone like me who's not allowed within a mile of this test. They really aren't worried that you're going to somehow advantage me because I'm not allowed near this. I'm on the no-fly LSAT list. But don't post specific solutions, answers, things like that. And really, during the test, don't even put topics out there publicly. Like I said, if you say something to me privately, it's no big deal. They've acknowledged that that's a fine thing, which is how we got here. Mostly, though, if you're going to do anything publicly, they just want you to wait until the main days are over. And if we don't hear from you, frankly, it's very hard to make predictions. You'll see at the very end of this tonight, there's a logical reasoning section, the 5th of 5, where I just have very little about it. I know it's real. I'm sure hundreds of people got it. I just didn't hear many topics. I think I've got like 3 or 4 confirmed. So I saved it for the end. But no, that's just really a matter of the fact that nobody told me about it. Or at least if they did, I missed it. Next, everyone feels rough when they come out of this test, or at least almost everyone does, especially, weirdly enough, fairly experienced test takers. They know enough to second-guess themselves and to self-doubt. That's a very normal thing. I got a message right before I came in here. I won't give the username. It was on Reddit, where it was like, do you ever hear stories of someone who feels bad or down and ends up sort of surprised by a positive score, a positive outcome? I just need to pick me up, basically, was the comment, I think. I got that message probably 50 times over the past few days. That's how common it is to feel this way. And my response to it every single time is, yes, I hear those stories every single test. I won't say it happens every time. Some people feel bad for good reason. But enough positive outcomes come out of this, even from really self-doubt and from disappointment. Originally at first, especially on test day itself, there's no reason for me to think that every person who feels bad deserves to. So just know that going into it. All right, next. When you hear me tonight, and you will inevitably at some point hear me use words like easier or harder, maybe even a word like easy, although I try to avoid that one. Remember that everything on this test is difficult to begin with. This is just relative discussions. Easier than a harder thing. Harder than a slightly easier, still hard thing. So please don't ever put yourself down or think that I'm being dismissive. I'm not. I'm just trying to rank things because that's kind of what we're here to do. The test makers, too, are actively attempting to confuse you, and never more so than what we just saw over the past several days. Honestly, this is one of the most active, almost malicious attempts at confusion. And I'm going to tell you why I don't think it was malice in just a minute. But this was a clear attempt on their part, I think, to throw as many different wrenches in the works as they felt like they could get away with over the past couple of weeks. They always do that. This was ratcheted up to a whole nother degree, as I'll explain. But they place the same topics in multiple sections. They swap orders around, as I mentioned before. They love to play these types of games to keep people guessing and to keep people uncertain, ideally all the way up to score release and beyond. That's why they don't release the content anymore, as they do want to keep this mysterious as much as they can. I'm here to help take some of the mystery out of it, but they're actively trying to do that. When we get to the end of this, and if you've heard one of these before, you'll know what's coming. But at the very end of this, when we start to talk about things like real and experimental, when we start to talk about things like scaling, we base all of this on certain assumptions about past behavior and about reusage. There's a couple of ways, for instance, and some of you may know this, there are a couple of ways that you can determine a real section versus an experimental section. The easiest way is if someone just doesn't have an experimental section. And that's an accommodation a lot of people are getting these days, presumably all well-earned and well-deserved. But if somebody just has 3 scored sections, then you know something. You know that everything they got counted. And the assumption has always been, and thankfully has not been broken yet, not even this week, that if it's real for one person, it's going to be real for everyone else who sees it. If it's experimental for one person, it's going to be experimental for everyone else who sees it. They don't swap back and forth. I heard that suspicion getting thrown around a little bit over the past few days. It's not happening. It didn't happen here. Look, I can't guarantee anything about the next test or the one after that, but so far they have stuck to the idea of it's kind of one or the other. Similarly, if somebody has 2 scored sections of logical reasoning and then 2 sections of reading comp, you know both of those logical reasoning are real. So you can use those to determine it for other people who might have had 3 logical reasonings and 1 reading comp. If someone has only 1 reading comp, you know it's real. You can use those passages to compare to other people with 2 reading comps and make decisions there as well. So that's another way that we can tell. And a final way that we can tell, and this has been really reliable, and I'm fortunate that we have kind of the catalog and archive of notes and details that we have about past tests, which is if they reuse a section in full that was scored in the past, every single time they have ever done that on a main administration, it has been a scored section again. They have never taken a past scored section and on a main administration like we just went through, used it as experimental. And I keep emphasizing main administration because occasionally on makeup tests, they will do this. They'll take some really old scored section like a February 16 section or something of LR, and they'll throw it in as experimental, almost as like a placeholder. I don't know why they do that. I don't know why they wouldn't use more experimental stuff and get more data, but that is what they sometimes will do on the makeup tests. So you'll see like 3 sections from 2021 and 1 from like Feb 17. And it's like, well, okay, there's an outlier here, the oddball. It's always been the experimental in cases like that. But barring that, barring some really like low-key one-off event, these main administrations, if they've used it as scored in the past, it'll be scored again. Unfortunately, they're just not reusing stuff as much anymore, as I'm about to explain when we talk about the crystal ball in a second. Finally, here, as we get to the end of this, it is possible, although I doubt it today, I feel pretty good about this. It's possible that you don't hear your section discussed, though. I think I got everything. I was really thorough. I probably talked to 600 people over the past few days and went through every single post as best I could. I don't think I missed anything. There is a section, as I said before, that's thin, but I think I've got them all. If you don't hear anything from your sections, though, and this will be in logical reasoning most likely, shoot me a message. It could happen. It's happened before, although it's rare. You just got to let me know, and I'll try to update things after the fact and catch up with you when that happens. And then I guess last thing, again, just as a reminder, if you don't mind, just don't throw like a 1-sentence summary of this whole thing online. Send people to the video, or I guess in this case, the recording. Okay, cool. Now that we're back in it, let's get down into the nitty-gritty of the test itself. And here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about both the domestic and the international test, because this was an international one. But what I saw internationally was interesting. Usually they split things up. They'll use material overseas that's different than what they do domestically, or at least in part different. They might have an overlapping section, but rarely is it wholesale use globally. But this time it was. And what that really tells me, I think, is that they just don't have a lot of content out there that they feel like they can burn. If it's good enough for America, or if it's good enough for South Korea, it's good enough for everybody. Seems to be the way they're approaching this so far. So we're going to talk about domestic and international together. I'm just going to lump them all in. If you're an international student and you hear this and you're like, oh, you missed my thing, it's because I didn't hear from you and I didn't know. Everyone I heard from overseas, though, had the stuff that I'm about to talk about. Before I do, we always kick these content discussions off with a quick self-assessment. In this case of the crystal ball, the one we did back in, I guess it was in December, for both January and February. It was like a double whammy. And as I mentioned a second ago, and I'm going to elaborate on it now, this is another one of those tests where LSAT stuck primarily to brand new content. 2 of the 3 scored reading comp sections were new. 4 of the 5 LR sections that were scored that I know of were new. And by new, what I mean is we've just never seen them used as a scored section before. They've been tested through experimentals and stuff. LSAT didn't just pull them out of thin air, but we've never seen these sections in totality as a scored thing previously. So most everything was not a reuse on this test, which obviously makes it tough for the crystal ball to make predictions of reuses when that content just isn't being used as much. However, knowing that that would likely be the case, I didn't make specific test reuse predictions. We've done that in the past. We did it for a long time, for years. We'd be like, we think they're going to use stuff from, November 2022. And sure enough, there'd be a passage set from it. There'd be a section of LR from it. We were really good at it, but they're not pulling things quite that, discreetly or frequently anymore. So what I've done instead for the past couple of crystal balls is I tried to stick to things that were a little more precise, passage topics, things like that. So let's talk about how that went, because there was a scored section, one scored section of reading comp that was a reuse. And it was the section that kicked off the week. It was the very first thing I saw when I woke up Wednesday morning and people started to kind of emerge and talk about the test. And I was pretty happy on the one hand because I predicted all 4 of these topics in the crystal ball. In fact, not only did I predict them, I went so far as to even highlight them in real time and be like, these 4 right here. I technically highlighted 8, but I was like, these are the ones that I think are most likely. These are the ones you should go. If you're not going to do anything else with these, do these. And sure enough, 4 of 4 is what we got this week. So I say I was mostly happy. The reason that I kind of flinched a little bit or grimaced a bit, this is a very notoriously hard section of reading comprehension. So looking at you, Borges, looking at you, gas giant planets, this is tough. And I knew as soon as I saw it, I was like, this is good because I predicted it. It made me happy, made some people happy. But this is going to be a long day for people who keep getting this. And they used it for the rest of the week as well. They also added 2 new sections, and I'm going to cover all 3 of those with you in just a second. Unsurprisingly then, interestingly enough, the only reused LR actually came from the same source test. So this was a case where I could have actually predicted a test. I didn't go that far. I didn't feel quite that bold. But that reused LR, which I'll talk about, also came from that same test. I'd call that a 4 out of 4. So I guess that's a win. If you're keeping score, it's 41 of the last 43 tests that we've attempted this for, that we've gotten at least something, largely a lot, right. But by and large, though, the content for the week was new and extensive. As I mentioned, there are 8 scored sections in total that we've got to get through. So let's hit it. And the first thing we'll talk about, as we always do with these, let's start with reading comp. I know you guys are eager to hear this. I'm going to start with the real section that I predicted. It comes from January 22 originally, but really August 23 was the test I had my eye on. And it had these 4 passages, 27 questions. It was Jorge Luis Borges, I think is how you say that, talking about aesthetic values, or his aesthetic values, his ideas of self and personal intention, calling them irrelevant. That was a tough passage to kick things off with. A lot of people were kind of punched in the face right out of the gate. There was a passage in there about bioengineered or biotechnologically engineered food and crops and product labeling regulations. They loved this. There were actually a couple of LR questions on this same thing. There was one in there, I'd love to read this actually, about violent media, might have been video games or films or something, causing violent behavior in children. That was the comparative passage in this section. And then I think we'd all pretty much agree, anyone who had this section anyway, the hardest passage in this was about the creation of gas giant planets, inner rocky planets, their cores. This had to do with like accretion disk and core accretion, protoplanets, things like that. So a very dense cosmological kind of passage that I think a lot of people struggled with, and for good reason. We've seen this twice before. Nobody's ever been happy about it. That's a tough section. A lot of people got that this week, but at least if you were paying attention in the crystal ball, maybe you studied up a little bit on gas giant planet formation. Maybe that helped. I heard from some people that it did. Next is a passage set that I first saw used internationally, and I was like, okay, this is new. And I thought it might just live overseas the whole time, but within a few hours the next day, they started using it here in North America too. Had 27 questions, but this is all brand new. 4 passages. The comparative started. It was about museums being allowed to sell their art or their assets. And then interestingly enough, I believe it was followed right away by another art topic passage. In this case, it was like a case study, a criminal case study or something, on stolen art and the statute of limitations on it. Specifically, it was a case with the Guggenheim Museum versus this poor woman, Rachel Lubell, who I guess had inadvertently purchased some stolen art, and they took it back from her, even though I'm not sure they should have. And that's kind of what that passage was about. There was a passage in there, interestingly enough, too, something that came up in a few logical reasoning questions about the impact of fur trading on territorial boundaries, specifically with native populations in Canada. I think it was like the Algonquin versus the Wampanoag tribes. I say this came up in LR. There were a couple things in here about like boundary disputes, native populations, things like that. It's one of their favorite topics in reading comp. They use it all over the place. And then, again, they saved the worst for last, frankly, the hardest question or passage in this particular set. You know it's coming if you've heard these first 3. It was about Galileo and a bit of Copernicus, but the trial of Galileo, the Inquisition, and the role of science versus religion in the trial of Galileo. And I think it largely was kind of built around this idea that some modern beliefs, which center on the fact that this was purely a religious concern, were incomplete. That the church, or whoever was doing this Inquisition, maybe knew a little more about the universe or the solar system than they let on, or at least they were really devoted to geocentrism, whereas Galileo was a strong proponent right after Copernicus about heliocentrism. But here's where this tripped me up. You guys had me chasing my tail for a little while when I first started hearing about this, because I heard those first 3 more or less steady, and those were really easy to spot and identify. But I kept hearing, I had Galileo, and then the next person would come in and say, well, I had those 3, but I had a semicolon. And I was like, what is this how is there a passage on a semicolon? And so I was thinking and I was looking and I couldn't figure it out. And I finally did the sensible thing, which I Googled Galileo semicolon. I'd have Googled Galileo trial semicolon. And sure enough, right away, there's an article that talks about it, where apparently some of the modern beliefs are mistaken or maybe misattribute religion as too great a cause, due to like a missing or a misplaced semicolon from one of the scribes or something back then. And so that's where all the semicolon talk was. For anyone who was watching this and didn't have the section, was confused, like, what's all this semicolon stuff? That's what it's about. Galileo and semicolon was the same passage, and was, in that section, I think, the hardest of the 4. And now we come to the third scored section of reading comprehension. And I'm just going to run through the topics really quickly. This is another new one, 27 questions. The first passage we'd actually seen before on an experimental section back in September of 24. I think it was the first one. This is this West African scholar, Solanke, I think, talking about the notion of pre-colonial Africa is wrong. Calling it pre-colonial is wrong. It doesn't exist. I don't know if these are in exact order, but these are the 4. Another passage in there was about computer video game design, the psychology and incentives of it, reward contingencies, fixed versus variable ratios and things. There was a passage in there on trademarks. That was a real surprise. Trademarks being considered similar to property law. They brought their boy John Locke out of retirement for this one. They've used him a few times. And then finally, again, the hardest passage at the end, circadian rhythm and eyesight or eye cells, rods, cones, and melanopsin. The effect of light, particularly on mammals. And there was a question in there. Funny, I had 2 immediate thoughts about this passage when I was hearing about it. First is a lot of people were complaining about a question in this passage on insects, who are not mentioned apparently anywhere in the passage at all. But it came to be known, at least to me, that there was a phrase in this passage about this melanopsin effect, the circadian thing, was kind of exclusive to mammals. And what a phrase like that, it's a little bit like the word only. It allows an inference about insects. It allows an inference about snakes. It allows an inference about fish, even though they're not talked about. If it's exclusive to mammals or whatever they said, keep in mind, I didn't read it. I'm hearing this secondhand. But it allows them to ask about insects because they wouldn't be in that group. They wouldn't have this property. So I think that's probably what the insect confusion was about. And the second thing, speaking of confusion, was a lot of people, I'm sure, ran into a word like melanopsin, and immediately it's a dividing point in this passage. I've seen this 100 times before, particularly in science passages with like vocabulary or ideas or phrases or something that people aren't familiar with. Immediately they encounter it and they either run around the wall or they just keep banging right into it or they freeze. When you see something like that, the easiest thing to do is just think about the context of it and power on. Keep going. If it's important enough that they're going to ask about it, you can look back in the passage. They don't ever expect you to know what it is. If you want to know what it is, it's a photoreceptive protein in your eye. It's nothing to do with like image making. It's just really good at kind of detecting variations in light, which is why it sends you to bed and gets you out of it. It controls circadian rhythms. Rods and cones control the images. So that was the third scored section. And if you think I'm just going to leave it there, no, I'm not. Because something else happened in this section that has not happened in almost 20 years. Since February 2006, this has never happened. This section did not contain comparative reading. There was not a single comparative passage in this entire section. And this section got used for thousands of people, day 1 through day 4. I heard about it on Wednesday midday and was like, okay, your memory's terrible. And then I heard about it again, and a 5th time, and a 10th, and a 20th, to the point where I actually went on their website and I looked at their public page about reading comprehension just to see, like, did they make a change and quietly announce it? Nope. As of Wednesday night, when I went to bed late, their public page still said about reading comprehension, you will have 3 single passages and you will have 1 comparative passage set. And yet for an entire day, that was a lie. They didn't announce this to anyone. They didn't tell us, and we kept it a secret. And we called them. There was a big conference in New Orleans. A lot of their top people were in New Orleans. I got on the phone with Dave Kaloran, my brother, and I was like, dude, call your boy. He's like, he's in New Orleans. I said, look, here's what's going on. Call your boy. And he goes, I'm on it. Called him right away and got confirmation. This wasn't just a one-time thing either. It wasn't a mistake. It's not a one-time thing. They're going to keep doing this. This is going to continue in February. It's going to continue in April and through the summer and maybe forever until they change something else for no reason. In fact, this was such a rush job that Dave mentioned, he's like, well, your website's wrong. That Thursday, when I looked at it again, they had changed that sentence. They rushed it so much that the new sentence has a typo in it, a bad typo. I'll read the new sentence that's still on their website as of this recording right now. It says this, and I quote, a reading comprehensive section, that's right, a reading comprehensive section will include either 3 or 4 single reading passages and either 1 or no comparative reading passages. They don't have these recently on their website for you to practice. You have to go back to PT 122 or earlier to find a section with 4 single passages. Not since February of 2006 has the test looked like this. And they did it without any announcement. They did it without any forewarning. They just changed it for some people. The amount of confusion, the amount of dismay for people coming out of this test thinking, my test was broken or something was wrong with my exam. Or I only have 1 reading comp section, but it had to be experimental. Surely that couldn't have been real. It's abhorrent. I have 2 very strong thoughts on this. The first is that this is unconscionable to do without any kind of advance notice. When they pulled logic games, and that's a more extreme analogy for sure, but they gave like 9 or 10 months notice that the test was going to change. If they had given at least a week on this, people would have gone in with some sense of like, all right, I could get one or the other. But every single person who took this test this past week studied doggedly for comparative reading, was ready for comparative reading, and probably a quarter to a third of them didn't get it and didn't know they weren't going to get it. That introduces a level of unfairness and uncertainty that is honestly borderline unforgivable. The fact that they would do this, I'm literally like, I've seen them do some very stupid things. I've seen them do some very baffling things before, but almost everything they've ever done kind of falls under the category of, why would you do that? This is much more, how could you do that? That's my first thought. I really hope they listen to this because they owe you guys an apology. I don't need one. I was fine. I mean, it didn't really cause me to suffer much more than trying to figure this confusion out and then help people work through it themselves. But this really, I mean, there's no way this should have happened. My second thought, though, and this is what's given me some comfort and some peace, is if you've ever studied any philosophy, and I promise this isn't a long tangent, but it's relevant. If you study like philosophy or logic, you know that in philosophy, at least, there's a lot of these like axioms or kind of like decisive tools that philosophers who mostly just sit around and talk about nothing in comfortable chairs. But their aim typically is to try to get to the real core, the kernel of truth of any kind of like problem or enigma or something. And so they use these tools basically that they call razors, like the kind you shave with. And they apply various ones to try to, again, shave away at the problem to get rid of the excess and get down to really the nut of the truth of it. The most famous of these, you guys probably have heard of, it's called Occam's razor. It was this old William of Ockham philosopher guy in like the 1300s. And it basically goes, I'll paraphrase, that the simplest explanation is usually the right explanation. A slightly more like elaborate thing would be like, if you can whittle away the things that have the most unfounded assumptions, you get down to the thing that has the least unfounded assumptions, and that's probably what's true. So Occam's razor is a really famous one. But the one that I was thinking of for the past week really is probably my favorite of all. It's called Hanlon's razor, Hanlon. And it goes like this. Never attribute to malice what could be explained by stupidity. And I think that's exactly what we're looking at. Sometimes it's said what could be explained by incompetence. They're interchangeable when it comes to this. I don't think they did this to be cruel. I don't think they did this to be malicious. I think they did this just because they can't get out of their own way. They're just not good at the public-facing side of this. They're amazing at designing this test. This is the best built test in existence as far as I'm concerned. It laps the GRE and the GMAT, for sure. It runs circles around things like the MCAT in terms of like its design and its cleverness and their ability, ultimately, internally, to make it. But when it comes to delivering it, my God, it's a clown show. And that's what we just saw for the past week. So if you happen to get a section that didn't have comparative and you were doubting your memory, or you were somehow doubting your prep, it's not you. It was them. And that's what happened. And this section here that was scored with circadian rhythm, it was the key instance of it. That wasn't the only strangeness to come out in reading comp, though. Let me tell you a little bit about the experimental sections. There were two of them, well, 2.5, as you'll see. Here's the first one. This was primarily paired with that Borges passage in the gas planets. It was fairly easy, relative. I did say it. Damn, I said I wouldn't. Easier, but 27 questions. And it had these 4 passages in it. There was one about like autocracies, I think, and democracies. Democracy being like versus political instability being an indicator of growth, economic growth. The comparative passage, so here we are, we're back, was about anthropomorphism. Human aspects basically applied to animals and plants, things like intelligence, feelings, androids dream of electric sheep, that kind of stuff. There was one in here about a book that everyone listening to this should go read immediately, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, not being taught correctly. And then finally a passage, I don't know if these are in order, about privacy engineering, about Google Maps and Google Street View. Apparently they originally didn't obscure people's faces. They drove around and took pictures of everything. And that was a problem, of course. That was a section of 4 passages, all experimental, all grouped together and coherent throughout the entire week. A lot of people got that. Double reading comp people got that a lot. But that wasn't the only experimental content on here. There was another set of sorts. Let me tell you about it. You may recognize these. 27 questions. Here we go. Scottish law, juries, and 3 verdicts. I was guilty, not guilty, and not proven. Apparently the author wasn't a huge fan of that. I heard something about Canadian juries in that one too. There was a passage in this about history and facts and empiricism. It had Herodotus and Thucydides, revisionist history. There was a passage about Gladys West and the invention of GPS, its military and satellite uses. And there was a passage about human rights organizations and abuses by non-governmental groups. Those 4, grouped together, were experimental. They also did not have a comparative passage. That's fine for experimental. I mean, that still would be a little bit above the line. That's too far to even do that experimentally without mention. But with experimental, they can get away with some stuff. That's kind of the point. That section did not have a comparative in it, and those 4 passages together were experimental. But then I started hearing these reports. Well, I had Scottish law, and I had that one about Herodotus, but I also had one about this indigenous laws and tribes keeping their legal and cultural systems in place. I had one about harvester ants and whether they can change their jobs when they need to. And I started saying, like, what? Those have to be 2 different sections. Nope. For the first time that I'm aware of ever, and they did it on the same test, no comparative, in a scored section, and in this experimental twosome here, there was 50% overlap. They never do that, but they did it this week. Scottish juries and Herodotus, Thucydides, revisionist history, those were together with 2 other passages back and forth. It was either Gladys West and human rights organizations, or it was this Andean community and how tribes keep their cultural systems in place, and harvester ants. Now, those were all experimental, but notice that's 6 passages used to make 2 different sections. They've never done that. So once again, people are coming out completely baffled and confused. I'm not as mad at them about this, although I still think it sucks. But again, it's one more way that they're clearly trying to confuse you and frankly confuse me. So be careful coming out of this test. Don't rely necessarily on the traditions that have always existed. Fortunately, they haven't really messed too much with the scored content traditions. And fortunately, this week, they didn't mess with logical reasoning really at all. So this is good news. Let's talk about logical reasoning. There were 5 sections of this, 4 of which I have a ton of data on, 1 I don't, as I mentioned. Let's start with the one that was the reuse. And this was the one I saw again early Wednesday. I don't know, it was paired with lots of different reading comps throughout the week, but it had these questions in it. This is from August of 2023. The first question in the section, I believe, was about British and English soldier heights and their suits of armor. There was one about Coca-Cola companies or something adding caffeine because they know it's addictive. The arrival of dingoes, heard about this one a lot, 4,000 years ago in some place, thylacines, I think, did not lead to the extinction of another animal. I guess they didn't eat the same thing or something. Amputation in brain signals and phantom limb syndrome. Sociological study on alcoholism trends, and it's more accurate than another one apparently. There was one about vitamin supplements in old people, movie stars or the cast of movies not getting along with directors. If they do, then fine, but if they don't go to the premiere or something. And then there was one in there about fluted glass versus regular glass and drinking speed, which I'd like to see that question. It's interesting. If you had even a few of those, that section was real. They did not mix and match topics or questions within different LRs. There was no swapping around here. That only happened in that one set of experimental RC. So again, even a couple of those questions, you can count that section was real for you. And I'll talk about what it means for the scaling in just a minute. Another one that was real, this was new. In fact, everything from here on out is new. This had Marie Curie's radiation hypothesis. I think it had to do with uranium, or some experiments she ran. Poor woman. 3 heist suspects, a lot of people talked about this, providing information to foreign government. So suspect 3 did this and suspect 1. I know the details somewhere else. They're in notes somewhere. And then one about a cat sleeping outside. It was either Libby's cat or Libby the cat. I don't know if Libby was the owner of the cat, but sleeping outside by the shed or somewhere else. Cobalt blue tarantulas can also see the color blue. And I think that had to do with like attracting predators and mates. There was one about a tsunami on Mars that was caused by meteors, scaffolding shading pedestrians, a fashion show, department stores, and ordering high fashion clothes. I think it was like, do we keep them in stock and limit supply, or do we go to excess and sell them? And then one about a government. Here's another one about this GMO thing. Government should ban labeling all natural products because it might mislead the public. So food labeling once again. All of those were in a section together. All of those are real. So even if all you remember is that cat or those heist suspects, that's a real section for you. A third scored real section. These are all new as well. First question right out of the gate is the one that most people recognize from this, I think, which had to do with eating at a diner, ordering a main dish, appetizer, dessert, cocktail, daily special, and something to do with tipping, I believe. A logic game kind of question with an interesting question stem attached. I believe it was a could be true, which is a real flashback to the days of logic games. There was one in here about the British Calico Act to prohibit the sale or distribution of foreign cotton and fabrics, textiles. One about vehicle manufacturers, adding features that could increase or worsen distracted drivers. Somebody said they had a question on CarPlay, the Apple's thing. I wonder if that's what this one was about. Makes sense. There's a question in this about poetry and poets, how some consider well-written advertising writers as poets. The author disagrees because of different motivations or something. Iron oxide on the moon. I'm guessing that's probably hematite. Uh, this is a strengthened question, I believe, and assuming that it is what I think it is, it probably has to do with either solar flares or some sort of Earth backwash. And then if it's strengthened, the causality in that, you either eliminate an alternate cause or you would just add more information to support whatever the cause was. That's my guess. There was one about chimps using hand gestures and prehumans. There was also a chimp question in that first section I mentioned, but it was about chimps being aggressive or non-aggressive, depending on their enclosures. And then finally in this section, there was one about caterpillar evolution and camouflage and baby birds that they have to be camouflaged because birds don't know they're poisonous, so they eat them. So there you go. A real section, all of those were together, but it only takes one or two, and then you're set. A fourth real section, all new once again, had questions on art traveling to another museum or allowing a museum to borrow it. There was a question a lot of people talked about a meteorite with some compound in it landing on Earth. There was one about email access being revoked and the creativity that increased from that. Conservative publishing was in this section. The one that most people have talked about, though, is maple trees. Specifically, it was chickadees either in parks larger than 10 hectares or chickadees in parks with maple trees, I guess bird watchers or something. Doing some study, maybe? I don't know. There was one about an oven dial being wrong and baking a cake, but the temperature was too hot. One about, this was interesting, two questions in this section about pop. One I think was pop art, and one was about pop songs, pop music. Songs I think was a must be true. Pop art I think was a flaw. So that's at least one way to tell them apart, but that is awfully sneaky. Those are too close for my taste. And then finally, a question in here about couples counseling or therapy. So there you go. And then finally we arrive at the fifth section. I know it's scored, but this was pretty rare. And I know it's rare because I only have 3 questions that I can guarantee are in it. I've got a lot of extra questions that I'm sure go somewhere. I know a lot of additional scored questions, but I just don't know where to place them. And so I didn't feel very good talking about like this I think goes here or this I think goes there. I know like milkweed decline linked to herbicides is real. Deforestation causing flooding in some old city. It's real. Dairy and almond milk advertising restrictions. That's real. I just don't know exactly where they go. So I'm trying to restrict any of that and keep these exclusive to what I do know for sure. Here's this 5th section. There was a question here about a fruit juice, some name brand, I think it was Yonkol or something, and adding sugars, adding artificial colors to it. The one that most people talked about here, it was about 4-foot-tall students and their preferences for different subjects, math, history, and art, and you had to rank them. This, I think, also had one of those kind of logic gamesy feels to it. And then finally, the only other topic that I'm sure of was respondents to a library survey being satisfied with the library's collection. So there you go, library survey. And that's it. There you go. There's your 8 scored sections and 2.5 more experimental reading comps. It's a lot to get through. Thank you for bearing with me through all of that. But now we've kind of arrived at the moment I know most people will have been waiting on, which is the scoring matrix. So let me take a beat and at first just introduce you to how it is that this matrix idea works. If you've never been to one of these before, it does take a bit of a preamble, just so you know what in the world we're talking about when I start saying things like -8, -9, -7 and stuff. So here's the way that this works. What I'm going to attempt to do is take every one of those scored sections, all 3 reading comps, all 5 logical reasoning, and for each one of them, I'm trying to give an estimation of its difficulty as to how I think it's going to move the scale, move the curve basically, at a 170 level score. If I think it's easier than average, it'll tighten the curve. You can't miss as many if it's easier. If I think it's harder than average, it's going to move the curve and loosen it up. So you can miss an extra question, say. If it's kind of in the middle, it probably won't do anything. If it's hard but not hard enough at a 170, it'll move the curve a little lower down, 163, 158, etc. And so with those, I'm going to assign a 0.5 value to them. And I'll reiterate this as I start to actually give numbers to sections, but that's how this is going to work. Our baseline, our starting point for this is -7. Now, -7 is a little tighter than the average curve actually is. The average curve now for a 170, it was a 8.34. They just released another test that's a -8, which we predicted, incidentally. That's probably going to tighten it back to like an 8.32. But Right around an 8.3 is the average number that you can miss. But that kind of hides a degree of variance that might be surprising to people. There are some tests out there where you can only miss 6 for 170. There are some tests, they're rare, where you could miss 10. So that 8 isn't just a little bit of wiggle room. It actually moves like plus or minus 2. And we may see some of that as we get into this tonight or today. Today for you, very much tonight for me. So let's start with reading comp, and I'm going to run through them one at a time. Remember, we start at a -7, and we'll see if it goes up or down or stays the same from there. And the first section of reading comp that I want to talk about is the reuse. August 2023, this had Borges, GMO crops, violent children, and then planet creation, gas giant planet creation. I said at the outset, this is a known hard section. This is easily a -1. This is easily going to take you to a -8 for a 170. I'm almost tempted to go like to a -1.5. I'm going to have to ask you guys who took it and have taken a lot of like practice tests before to use your judgment there. If this is one of the hardest things you've ever seen, then you can probably add that extra 0.5 to it. I don't happen to think so. We've never done that before. This has always been a -1 section for us, the 2 times that we've seen it. So right now, if you had that section, you're at a -8 is my best guess. The other new sections, one was on the museums that sell art or their ability to, the stolen art case with the Guggenheim, fur trading boundaries, and then Galileo's trial, and in parentheses, I've got semicolon. This was probably the easiest from what I heard, and don't freak out, I said easiest, of the 3 scored sections. To me, this is a 0.5, which is to say I don't know that it's going to move the needle at a 170. I think you're probably still stuck at a -7. I'm sorry to say. I know Galileo is tough. I just don't feel like there was enough difficulty for the section as a whole that it's going to hit people that high level in a way that would necessarily penalize them for an extra point. But I do think as a 0.5, if you're at a 164, if you're at a 157, I think this is where you're going to catch some benefit from this, because this was genuinely not an easy section. I just don't think it was as hard as the other 2. I don't think it quite qualifies. And then finally, there was the no comparative section, which had pre-colonial Africa, video game design, trademarks with John Locke, and then, of course, circadian rhythm. This to me falls right in the middle of the difficulty of those other 2. This to me is just a 1. If I could do, and I'm never going to do this, but if I could get away from 0.5s and do 0.25s, then planet creation of Borges would be 1.25. Museum art, Galileo, would probably be at 0.75, and then pre-colonial Africa and circadian rhythm would be a 1. So that's how close together these things are. I'm not going to get into quarter digits, but that's where I think you are. So again, planet creation, Borges, you're at a -8. Museums and art, Galileo, you're probably still at a -7. Circadian rhythm, I think you're at a -8 as well. Let's move on to logical reasoning. So remember where you are, who you are right now, starting this. 5 sections of logical reasoning to go through. Listen for your 2, and then keep doing a little bit of arithmetic. The first one I'll do is the one that, again, was a reuse. This is from August 23. This had soldier armor, dingoes, phantom limbs, alcoholism, fluted glass. We've had this one as a -1 always. So again, if you were at a -8 before, this takes you to a 9. If you were at a -7, this would take you to a -8. We've always had this as a -1. I think this was probably the hardest of the 5 sections through the week. The 4 others are all new. So again, our first encounter with them. One of the new ones had Marie Curie, the 3 high suspects, the cat sleeping outside, tarantulas, scaffolding. I think this is a 0.5. Right on the nose, I think this is a 0.5. Which means, again, if you were sitting with a 0.5 from earlier, like Galileo, I think that would take you to a -8. And if you had this one and the dingoes, I think that would take you to a -9. So that to me would maybe make up for some of the 0.5 slipperiness that I gave you earlier. So again, tarantula, scaffolding, heists, 0.5. Add that to your number wherever it was. We get to another new section. This is the diner with the tipping and the special whatever appetizers and stuff. Poetry versus ads, iron oxide, chimps and their hand gestures, caterpillar camouflage. This was, I don't know if it was the easiest section, but it's tied for easiest if it's not. This is a 0. I don't think this does anything. I didn't see too many complaints aside from that diner question, which admittedly was tricky. But one tricky question is not enough to move the needle, especially at the higher levels. It's just not going to do it. Next, we've got another new section. This is the meteorite on Earth, email access, conservative publishing, maple trees, and pop couples counseling. This to me lives right between a 0.5 and a 1. I'm probably going to be conservative. I always am, and say this is a 0.5 as well. Use your judgment here, guys. If you took this and you're like, that's a really, really hard section, that's harder than most of what I've seen, even on looser scale tests that I've done, take it as a 1. I don't know that it quite gets there. Logical reasoning has a hard time having that kind of impact. But there you go. I think that's probably a 0.5 as well. So add that to what you had. And then we get into that final new section where I've only got the 3 topics for sure. I've got a few others that I think, but fruit juice with the added sugar and color, 4-foot-tall student subjects, and then that library survey. Everything I heard about this, which admittedly wasn't much, was mild. So I think this is a 0. So that gives a real range of possibilities. There's no one here who's going to stay at a 7, but some people might be somehow at a 7.5. If so, I'd be surprised if it stayed a 7. I think most of these tests are probably 8s or 9s. I doubt anything gets you to a 10 though, for the wishful thinkers out there. I'd be surprised if we could see that kind of stack, but again, that's how I think this adds up. And like I said, I could have missed something. If there's a section that I don't have, I don't think so, but please let me know. And then based on your feedback from that, I'll try to give you my best estimate for it, and we could add it into the mix as well. So there you go. A weird test week, a lot of content. If you've made it this far though, both through the test and just with me tonight, I appreciate it. Remember, you've got a score release coming up, January 28th. That'll be at 9 a.m., but probably a little before if you want to get refreshing your email or your LSAT account. And that's it. Guys, I'm proud of you for getting through this one. They threw a lot of curveballs unnecessarily and certainly unexpectedly. I don't know if those were curveballs so much as just thrown right at your face, but I'm proud of you guys for getting through it, and I'm very, very grateful. I couldn't do this sort of thing if you guys didn't really all help me out. So, I mean, it takes a village, and I'm really proud to be a part of yours. So thank you guys again. I will certainly be talking to you soon. If you're coming to the home stretch course next Wednesday night, I'm looking forward to seeing you. There's a crystal ball coming up in early March. Until then, take care of yourselves. Go have some fun. You've certainly earned it. And yeah, we'll all be in touch. All right, guys, take care.